Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With Israel's latest attack on Hamas leadership in Qatar, why is America missing in action? Let's get to the bottom line. It sounds like something straight out of the Red Wedding scene from the epic fantasy Game of Thrones, where U.S. President Donald Trump issued a, quote, last warning to Hamas to accept the deal with Israel on Gaza. But when the Hamas leadership met to discuss his plan in the Qatari capital of Doha, Israel launched an attack to decapitate them all. At least 5 Hamas members were killed, along with a member of the Qatari security forces. It seems that the top Hamas negotiators survived, but the same can't be said of the chances for stability in the region, especially as more countries lose their sovereignty to Israel's rampage through the region, with 6 countries now across the Middle East bombed in the last few months, all with Washington's support. So what is the U.S. actually trying to achieve? Today, we're talking with political scientist John Mearsheimer, professor of international relations at the University of Chicago, and he's author most recently of How States Think, the Rationality of Foreign Policy. Dr. Mearsheimer, thank you so much for joining us. Look, every time I have you on the show, it's because I really want to know what's happening in the international system, what's happening to U.S. power. How are other leaders seeing this moment?
Well, I mean, things in the international system are really terrible. It's just hard to believe. Just to go to the Middle East for a second, I think the most important event there that should be paid attention to is the genocide in Gaza. It's very important to emphasize that the Israelis, with the assistance of the United States and to a lesser extent the Europeans, are executing a genocide in Gaza. And the attack in Doha, the Israeli attack in Doha, was designed to kill the Hamas negotiators for the purpose of making sure that there would be no negotiated settlement of the conflict in Gaza so that the Israelis can continue their genocide. So that's one thing that's going on in the Middle East that matters enormously. The second thing that matters enormously is that the Israelis, in all likelihood, are going to attack Iran for a second time in the fall of this year. And then if you switch to Europe, where you have the second trouble spot of real note, what you see is that the Russians are continuing to roll back the Ukrainians. It's quite clear the Russians are going to win on the battlefield, and that's what matters the most. There's not going to be a negotiated settlement, and you have a real danger of escalation in that crisis as the drones that moved into Poland show.
You know, the Prime Minister of Qatar called this a betrayal, and that Qatar's entire defense relationships in the region now have to be rethought. There are 10,000 U.S. military personnel inside Qatar. If you were Qatar or any of these other Gulf states, how would you be seeing it from their perch?
Well, I would be profoundly upset if I was seeing it from their perch. There's no question about that. And of course, that's exactly what you're seeing. The Saudis, UAE, Qatar, they're profoundly upset about what has just happened. They fully understand that the Israelis can do anything they want, and the Israelis will back them at every turn. And this is not in their interest. The question is, what can they do in response? What kind of leverage do they have? The UAE has an Abraham Accord with Israel, and it could put an end immediately to that Abraham Accord. That would send a very clear message. And then those 3 countries and other countries in the region could get together and try to make it clear to the United States that this is unacceptable. But they just don't have a lot of leverage.
We hear the Qatari Prime Minister asking openly whether Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's concept of a new Middle East means a new Gulf, means a refashioned Gulf. The Gulf typically has been able to avoid a lot of the weather of the changes, but since October 7, 2023, Israel has attacked 7 nations in the region. And now this incursion, which has really gotten a really dramatic counterreaction from the Gulf, I think has raised fears about what security, the building blocks of security among these states are, and what Israel's intentions might be. I'd just be interested if you have any insights into that.
Well, I think that these Gulf states that we were talking about before, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, don't have much to worry about. And I'll say more about that in a second. What you want to understand is that the Israelis are interested in creating a greater Israel. That's their first goal. And that means conquering territory and incorporating it into a greater Israel in places like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Sinai. They want Lebensraum. The second thing the Israelis want is they want to get the Palestinians out of greater Israel. They want to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, and they want to drive them out of the West Bank. That's their second goal. Their third goal is they want to make sure that all of their neighbors are weak. They want to make sure that Lebanon and Syria are never a cohesive whole and therefore never a threat to Israel. What they have done or are trying to do in Iran is they're trying to break Iran apart. They want Iran to fracture. They want Iran to be weak. They want Iran to look like Syria. So countries like Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Egypt, these are countries, and Jordan I would throw in as well, have to worry greatly about Israel trying to break them apart and weaken them. But I do not think they have territorial goals that involve Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE. And what they depend on with those countries is for the United States to make sure that there are good relations between Israel and the Gulf states. What the Israelis want with Saudi Arabia is an Abraham Accord, similar to the one that they have with the UAE. They want to have good relations with the Gulf states. So I think this attack on Doha notwithstanding, the Israelis are not a direct threat to the Gulf states, but they are a direct threat to all those other states I listed because they get in the way of creating a greater Israel that is bigger than the one that existed after 1948.
We here in this show and media all around the world are watching the White House, and I got to be honest, folks, it's often a kabuki act. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's real, what's not. But the President of the United States, President Trump, seems to be sending signals that he's telling Netanyahu not to bomb again, not to do this again, and we're getting very mixed signals about what the president knew and at what steps he ordered Steve Witkoff, his negotiator, to advise Qatar that this attack was coming. And Qatar said, hey, we didn't hear it until we heard the bombs down the road. And there are some in Israel saying that President Trump did give a green light to this attack happening. I'm interested in your long experience watching commanders-in-chief, chief executives in the White House of the United States. What do you think is real, and what do you think we need to be suspicious of?
Well, first of all, you want to understand that the United States and Israel basically act as a tag team. They, operate together, and no matter what Israel does, the United States supports it unconditionally. So I think what happened here is that the Israelis decided that they would kill the negotiators in Doha. These are the Hamas negotiators, because the Israelis are primarily interested in making sure there are no negotiations that settle the conflict or come close to settling the conflict in Gaza. So if you kill the negotiators, there's no negotiations. I don't think that the United States was in cahoots with the Israelis. I don't think we planned this operation together. But I find it hard to imagine that the Israelis didn't tell us what was coming, or if they didn't tell us what was coming, that we didn't detect it. Given our intelligence capabilities in the Middle East, there's no way we would have not seen this attack coming. And again, I think the Israelis would have told us anyway. And the question is, did President Trump or whoever was in charge of this issue, and the administration tell the Israelis they couldn't do it. And the answer is no. We basically green lighted the attack, and now we're making all sorts of noises that make it sound like we really didn't do that. But of course, we did do that. And the Israelis understand full well that they could do it again, and we would let them do it again.
So who's in charge? Who's leading who in this case? Is it the tail wagging the dog, or is the dog wagging the tail? Is Israel acting as America's agent in this activity, or has Israel successfully commandeered this giant country with all of its military might to pursue its purposes? How do you see who's in charge?
There's no question in my mind that the Israelis are in charge, that Benjamin Netanyahu is the more powerful actor when it comes to the balance of power between him and President Trump. And this is hardly surprising. As you know, Steve Walt and I wrote a book called The Israel Lobby that laid this out in great detail. The United States has a special relationship with Israel that's unparalleled in history. The extent to which the Israelis have President Trump wrapped around their little finger is truly amazing. You just take President Trump and how he deals with the rest of the world. He treats virtually every country on the planet with contempt. He, slaps every country on the planet around at least once a week. But when it comes to dealing with Israel, he never does that. He never puts any pressure on the Israelis not to do X, Y, or Z. And again, he supports Israel unconditionally, as did his predecessors.
I'm interested as you sort of look forward, given these kinds of provocations that we're seeing, both from Russia testing the White House, from Israel testing what's real and not in the broad Middle East and where Trump is. What do you expect to see in the behavior of other nations in the next few years?
Well, just look at what's happening now. There are three great powers in the system. We're now in a multipolar world, and those three great powers are China, Russia, and the United States. And because of our foolish policy in Ukraine, we have pushed the Russians and the Chinese close together. They are now, at this point in time, very close allies, despite the fact that in the past they've had very testy relations, if not terrible relations. But today, that's not the case. And it's not the case because the United States, given what it's doing in Ukraine, has pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Then take the Indians. India is not yet a great power, but it is definitely a major power. And it looked until very recently that it had good relations, improving relations with the United States. But President Trump decided to get rough with the Indians because the Indians are importing Russian oil. And the end result is that the Indians and the Chinese and the Russians have all moved close together. And you see all sorts of other examples. Just take BRICS and what's happening with BRICS. There's no question that BRICS has become a more formidable institution over time. And BRICS, of course, includes not just India, Russia, and China. It also includes countries like Brazil and Turkey. And all of those countries are angry with the United States for one reason or another. And through international institutions like BRICS, they make their anger known. So we have this very interesting situation where the United States has pushed all sorts of countries into an oppositional camp. And we're left with allies like the Europeans and the Israelis. Those are our best friends in the world today. But then if you look at the Europeans and you look at U.S.-European relations, they're actually much worse today than they were 10 years ago. And everyone expects that those relations will get worse with time. So you see that U.S.-European relations are not good. And all of this tells you that the United States, except for Israel, is reaching a position where it's pretty much all alone in the world. And given that President Trump will be in the White House for 3+ more years, one would not expect this situation to change anytime soon.
You know, John, President Trump has really, and I've listened to him carefully, has really prided himself on being the peace president. You know, he's out there recorded and reported to be interested in the Nobel Peace Prize, working to bringing various contenders in conflicts all around the world together to deal with this. You know, he said that, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu and others are those that he can basically move around in the way he wants. I guess my question is, are we seeing the peace wannabe president dissolve into impotence and insignificance in all of these major conflicts?
Well, there's no question that the United States is still the most powerful state on the planet. If you look at the multipolar world that we operate in, it's clear that China is a peer competitor of the United States, and that the United States lives in fear that China will become as powerful, if not more powerful, than the United States. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers, for sure. But nevertheless, it is important to understand that we still are the most powerful state on the planet, although China is a peer competitor. But this is a fundamentally different situation that existed during the unipolar moment. That's the period after the Cold War ended, from roughly 1992 up to about 2017. We were the only great power on the planet. We were incredibly powerful relative to everybody else. That world has gone away. And again, we now have two great powers, one of which is a peer competitor. So that's point number one. Point number two, Steve, is that it's very important to understand, and Western policymakers and Western strategists have a difficult time understanding this, that there's limits to what you can do with your military power. We tend to think that having a big stick and threatening people with that big stick or using that big stick allows us to always get our way. Just think about Afghanistan. We lost in Afghanistan. When I was young, we lost in Vietnam, despite the fact that the United States was far more powerful than Vietnam, and the United States is far more powerful than the Taliban in Afghanistan. But the fact is that we lost. There are just limits to what you can do. And there are limits to what the United States can do in the Middle East, even though it is incredibly powerful. And there are limits to what we can do in Ukraine against Russia. And therefore, it is not that we're impotent, because we're not impotent. Again, we are the most powerful state on the planet. But nevertheless, there are limits to what we can do with that power under any circumstances, but certainly in a world where you have two rivals, the Chinese on one hand and the Russians on the other.
How tenuous are things for the West Bank? John, you just talked about the West Bank. So the UAE and other states are saying absolutely no more discussion of annexation. But inside Israel, you know, who knows where that's going? But I'm just interested, as you just said, is the West Bank's lifeline tenuous?
Well, Steve, you already have de facto annexation. What we're talking about here is de jure annexation. And if you look at what the Israelis have been doing in the West Bank since October 7th, it surely is not as horrible as what's happening in Gaza. But you see all sorts of evidence of ethnic cleansing. You see all sorts of evidence that the Israelis want to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank. That's really the key issue here. I don't think whether you have de jure or de facto annexation matters that much. You have annexation. And what you're going to get in the future, if the Israelis have their way, is you're going to get ethnic cleansing. It's just that the Israelis have been concentrating mainly on Gaza up to now, where they're executing a genocide, which is designed to facilitate ethnic cleansing. So people are not paying much attention to what's going on in the West Bank. But for those of us who watch what's going on in the West Bank, it's absolutely horrible what's happening there. And it will only get worse with the passage of time, because the political center of gravity in Israel is only going to shift further to the right over time. And there's going to be more and more pressure to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank as well as Gaza.
Is there ever going back to a period of benign American hegemony if there were different leadership in the United States? Or are we seeing tectonic adjustments that no matter who the leadership is in the United States in the future, this is permanent? We're seeing trends that are irreversible.
Well, I don't think, if you define benign as exercising soft power, right? In
Right.
other words, having a velvet glove that goes over the mailed fist, which we were very good at for a long period of time, and which obviously President Trump is not good at. I would imagine that at some point in the not too distant future, the United States will understand that having taken the velvet glove off and exercising nothing but mailed fist over other countries is counterproductive, and that you want to at least appear somewhat as a benign hegemon or a benign great power. So I don't think that the situation you see today is forever. But I think, Steve, you never want to lose sight of the fact that the United States is a ruthless great power, and that the soft power that we've exercised in the past was largely designed to cover up our basic ruthlessness. Great powers just act that way, and they go to great lengths to disguise their behavior. And the United States is very good at that. But I think what's happened with President Trump is that he's taken the mask off, or he's taken the glove off, the velvet glove, and we've behaved in a very heavy-handed way. And that has not worked to our advantage, for sure.
Look, I have to admit, and at the time of this recording, folks, a lot has happened. We saw a man named Charlie Kirk, who was a Republican influencer, very influential with a lot of young people, killed in the United States. And it's made me wonder, John, whether norms that we were depending on, whether the guardrails of how democracies process debate and different sides contend, whether the wheels are coming off. And I'd love to get your insights on this moment, which to me feels very wobbly.
Well, I think the assassination of Charlie Kirk is absolutely horrible. And I think it represents a serious threat to American democracy, because it could lead to greater violence. When I listen to President Trump and other people like Elon Musk talk, I really worry that this is going to lead to an outbreak of conflict between people on the left and people on the right. So I think the United States is in real trouble. I never imagined that we would be in this situation, to be honest. I thought it was unthinkable. I thought the United States basically had a system in place that was accepted by a large enough proportion of the population that we would avoid trouble of this sort. This was the kind of trouble you expected in other countries, but not in the United States. But I was obviously wrong. I mean, we're in a very tenuous situation, and there is a possibility, and again, I underline the word possibility, that this could spin out of control.
Well, we will leave it there. These are serious times, and I always learn from you, John, when we have these serious issues to discuss. Thank you so much. Political scientist John Mearsheimer, really appreciate your candor and for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Whatever was considered normal before has been thrown out the window. Predictable behavior by states large and small has just collapsed. Alliances, the rule of law, global institutions like the UN or even NATO are giving way to an ad hoc, dog-eat-dog, might-makes-right world. That's a really dark reality, folks, one that mankind has seen before, but it has been a long time. In this bleak period in global affairs, we see the impact of impunity, both around the world and here at home in the United States. Russia's incursion into Poland with drones and now Israel's bombing attack inside Qatar are tests of the Trump White House. Now the questions remain. What will the U.S. do? What does America even stand for? Trump's going to try to avoid giving a lot of answers. But these are the issues that will have staggering significance for all of us in the years to come. And that's the bottom line.